Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and welcome to another English language episode of Danish TV channel, the global voice of the Center for Muslim World Studies. And it is a great delight and a pleasure of mine to have a very dear friend and an incredible scholar, Dr. Maytha Alhassen, with us, who where can one begin? Her commitments to both her scholarship as well as to a variety of social justice movements, anti-racist movements within the United States. Her own background being within academic background in covering ethnic studies. She did her Ph.D. from the University of Southern California. She's a Ph.D. fellow right now, and just an incredibly inspiring figure, I think, within the American mosaic of the Muslim community. Dr. Maytha Alhassen is incredibly inspiring because precisely because of the wide array of both scholarly, academic, as well as her role as a public intellectual committed to all of these various social justice movements and being very much a part of them, being very much at service to these movements. So it gives me, again, great delight and great pleasure to welcome Dr. Maytha Alhassen to our show. So welcome, Maytha.
Yeah, assalamu alaikum. Thanks for having me. Just want to do a land acknowledgement that I'm on unceded Tongva territory right now. And that's part of the work for me. We just start there.
Absolutely, and walaikum salam. And just to for our viewers here that may not have picked up on why that acknowledgement is necessary, because both the United States, Canada, and many other countries are what we call settler colonial states. These are countries in which settlers, largely from Europe, have come, colonized land, often wiped out the local population, and declared their land their own, as if they discovered it. So, what Dr. Maytha has done is an acknowledgement of that sin, that crime that was committed against the indigenous population who had been living here for generations. So I just wanted our viewers to
Oh,
kind of
that's
know
great. I just want
exactly.
to add something too for people to
Sure.
understand the context. There have been over 600 treaties that the it, native population, after being genocided and ethnically cleansed,
Yeah.
tried to set up with this government. I'll speak specifically about the US, but it is an America's issue, as you mentioned. And
Hmm.
they broke those treaties that they signed that made it even more smaller, territory wise, more dangerous and inaccessible to basic needs. And at this
Hmm.
point, is always it has always violated everything that it's put out there. So we acknowledge, because that was part of the negotiations, was they
Right.
were supposed to have a right of access and sovereignty. And we've turned our back on that. And as you said, if we turn our back on commitments on land that we live, then
Mm.
how are we supposed to spiritually align with our own journey?
Absolutely. That's wonderfully put. And this whole notion of well, these one treaty after the next violated again and again. It was in many ways a concerted project, to kind of trick the individuals, the indigenous populations, that look, we will stop here and go no further, and then basically violate that entire principle and take over the entire North American continent. So no, you're absolutely right about that, and I think that was a very powerful way to actually begin our conversation that we're going to have today. So the major theme that I wanted Dr. Maytha Alhassen to speak about today is an area in which I frankly, cannot find a better expert on than than Dr. Maytha. And that is about the figure of Malcolm X and what he represented in the 20th century, who he was. We in Pakistan and in other parts of the Muslim world as well certainly have heard of his name, along with, say, Muhammad Ali and others. Uh, but but Malcolm X and the political figure of Malcolm X, the relationship with the politics of his time, in combination with his Muslimness, um, and how that defined him and compelled him to a certain um, ideological, theological, political positions that he took at the time that often, very, very often, in fact, we, over the generations following that period, uh, Muslims in the United States, Muslims throughout the world, we really do forget that type of very principled, principled trajectory of politics that Malcolm X engaged in. I mean, obviously, he's a human being; he's not flawless either. But we, in some ways, the objective that I really wanted from this program is to, in some ways, kind of recover that legacy of Malcolm X that we are remain many of us largely remain ignorant of, and how that can, in some ways, motivate, inspire us to adopt positions today that would be consistent, not just with Malcolm X, what Malcolm X would be doing, but in some ways with our own faith tradition and that prophetic impulse to respond to, as I was saying earlier, the enormous cruelties and injustices that we confront in the world today. So, without further ado, Dr. Maytha Alhassen, the virtual floor is yours to speak about Malcolm X.
I'm used to giving an hour and a half lecture. Let me see if I can condense, as most of us academics are prone to being pretty
Yes,
loquacious, trained to be.
absolutely.
I think I would start. Firstly, I'm honored to be positioned in that way. I certainly have studied Malcolm X and his travels, reading his travel diaries, interviewing people, conducting oral history interviews with people who knew him for probably now almost close to 2 decades.
Wow.
It's been a deep work that has actually found its way into my own family life. I'll talk about
Wow.
that later, but my mother's uncle, and I write about this in my dissertation. Hopefully, we're going to turn it into something else so it's not as inaccessible, but he ended up becoming Malcolm X's witness when he went to the Hajj court to be verified as a Muslim so that he could go to Hajj.
Wow.
And his name was written several times in Malcolm X's diaries as I was going through the micro film at the Schomburg where his work has been archived. I mean, I nearly fell out of my chair looking at
I
them.
would imagine. I would imagine that's incredible.
So there
Wow.
is, yeah, no, I mean, I think it's fated. I think that I've been guided to do this work as part of continuing a legacy, and I know that it has probably shown up in so many people's lives that have experienced that same kind of synergy through the signs that are being unveiled to them.
Yeah.
Um, I'll also add, though, that I think that there are incredible people out there that are doing the work, like Zahir Ali, who also does deep dives into his Islam and understands the Black Muslim, especially Black Muslim New York community, understands NOI more than anybody that I know in a scholarly
Mm.
capacity. So please look at his work. He continues to
Yes.
and was part of a team that I found myself in called, not found myself, was delightfully a part of, called the
Right. Right.
X Project at Columbia. And we did the work to try to archive all this material about him and understand who Malcolm was within the historical context of
Right.
how he was evolving. And that's the thing that's missing from our storytelling
Right.
of who he is. Because, most folks hear his name, outside of the US, it probably isn't a problematic binary that we have here, which is they usually pose Malcolm X in opposition to Martin Luther King, one as being violent and one as being non-violent. That's the general stereotype, and that's how people encounter his name. And then they might watch film about him or read the autobiography and then get introduced to a completely new world and journey of a person who has struggled through faith, struggled through the afterlives of chattel slavery, as we were talking about, and what settler colonialism did to people on the margins, to a Black American population that never was given reparations, that was never given its due for the sin of slavery, the 400 plus year sin that only got extenuated through Jim Crow.
Yes.
And, up until now, we still haven't rectified a lot. And so Malcolm X is growing up in this Jim Crow era. He's born as his mother was pregnant. Their house was firebombed by white supremacists because his parents were involved in a movement called the UNIA, Back to Africa movement by Garvey, and they were Garveyites. Mm-hmm. And so what Garvey had envisioned for Black Americans was that there wasn't going to be justice in the US, so we have to fund our exodus back to Africa. And they were activists, and actually his mother was from Canada, originally from the Caribbean, so he had connection to a deeper world outside of the US anyways. So not only was he born to activists, he was born with the most violent state repression possible through vigilantes that have never been treated seriously. So you have to understand, when you're born in those conditions, it does create a radical vision of freedom. And so Malcolm, and as he is still influenced by the Nation of Islam, even if he left the nation, was committed to three things that he writes about all the time: freedom, justice, and equality. And so he, a little bit of his background story so we can understand how he becomes a prolific figure that is more than the firebrand that he is positioned in the US script and narrative, the dominant script and narrative.
And the Malcolm X movie. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
So the Malcolm X autobiography and the movie kind of go through these stages of his life. And he, at the very beginning, as we said, was raised in Omaha, Nebraska. Because of the violence that his parents received, they moved to Lansing, further north. And part of his story also shows that it's not just the South of America that has and created a state of terror for Black Americans. It's all America. And so in Lansing, his father one night mysteriously is killed by a train, and he's tied to the train tracks. But local law enforcement say it's a suicide. When it was clear, again, that people didn't like that he was involved in all these activities that were liberatory. And so his mother is raising a ton of children, and she is then committed to an institution, a mental institution, and the kids are split up in foster homes. And Malcolm is actually excelling at school. And then at one point in 7th grade, he tells one of his teachers he wants to become a lawyer. And one of his teachers responds to him and says, "That's not a realistic job for an N-word."
Right.
And so that is incredibly demoralizing for him. And he leaves his setting, goes to Boston to stay with his stepsister, and gets involved in the Zoot Suit music culture of the area, but then also gets involved in petty crime and goes back and forth between New York and Boston. And then eventually he starts robbing houses with his friend and friends, including a couple of white women. They get caught, and they not only arrest him and his friend, but they send them to prison, and the white women are let off. So some people, and he said he interprets from this that his crime was being with white women, with the white
Right.
woman. So in prison, initially it is a struggle for him. Clearly, prison is a struggle for everybody.
Right.
And he writes letters back and forth to his family. One of his family members, a couple of them actually get introduced to the Nation of Islam. And so they write to him about it. He starts learning not only about the nation, but he does his own studies. He studies philosophy. He studies Sufi poetry. He's a part of debate societies. But the other thing that prison did for him was that as he was getting acquainted to the philosophy of the Nation of Islam, he was starting to see the environment around him that was anti that, anti-Muslims praying, not accommodating that, serving them pork. So he was organized against those things in prison already.
Wow.
So that's happening in the 1940s. And once he gets out, he gets very active in the nation, eventually gets promoted to head the nation in Harlem, their office there. And one of the biggest moments for him, and then I'll get to the international stuff in a second, but I think it's fundamental for us to understand how the nation grew him. Because
Absolutely.
what I like to do is say, oh, he became traditional Sunni Muslim,
right,
conventional, and that's all we need to focus on. But there are parts of him that are retentions from how he was. So at one point, you know, in Harlem, what was really popular on 125th Street is to take a street corner and as a religious figure to preach, to get an audience of people who are walking on the street. So this is something he would do. Of course, he's such a powerful orator, and the Nation of Islam would organize events like the Afro-Asian Bazaar, where they would bring in people from across the globe to speak to this solidarity and this vision that the nation had of the Afro-Asiatic, which is a peoples that were both basically the global South. And that was already happening. The nation had such a pulse on global politics. And if you look at the paper that Malcolm actually started called Muhammad Speaks, tons of references to what, quote unquote, the Third World Movement, interviews, commentary. So they were starting as part of their politics of transcending the confinements of the American identity, trying to be transnational. So, but at one point, you know, as I said, he was kind of this corner speaker, although they did definitely have a temple. People had been telling him, you guys, what are you about even? What does the nation do for us? So one day, one of their members was violently assaulted by the NYPD. And instead of being taken to a hospital, they took him to a jail. And so Malcolm, infuriated with this, and of course the community, led a massive march to the jail and demanded that he be released. And they would not leave until he was released. And guess what? They were effective. He was transferred to a hospital. And the police officers were held accountable. So right there, he sedimented his commitment to justice, his power in responding to state violence. So that sets up, and you know, there's a whole bunch of stories.
And one must admit that at least in the movie is quite a powerful scene. That incident,
Yeah, and you can get a shorthand for all of this. So that period when he was a petty criminal was called Detroit Red, and then that's what they would call him because he has this red hair and he's tall. So Malcolm, although was doing this work locally, as we said, was fascinated by this third world movement that was happening, took particular interest in the Bandung conference, or the conference that was happening in Bandung that gathered together leaders from third world countries, especially decolonized ones, to get on an agenda of non-alignment. And him and the Nation of Islam were enthralled by Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser's ability to hold Britain and France at bay and to win back the Suez Canal after he nationalized it. So they even had a cable from the Egyptian president in the Muhammad Speaks newsletter that he sent to them. And so later in 1959, Malcolm actually goes to the Middle East and Africa because he's trying to set up an Umrah trip for Elijah Muhammad, who's the leader at the time of the Nation of Islam. And so he starts getting acquainted, goes to Sudan, loves the Sudanese people, goes to Saudi Arabia, doesn't perform Umrah himself at that point, but he's making those connections globally. And then when he comes back, he becomes national spokesperson. There's a lot of detail we could get into about why he leaves the nation. But after he leaves the nation, he forms his own organizations, one that is Muslim specific called Muslim Mosque Incorporated, and another one that's called the Organization of African American Unity, that is inspired by the Organization of African Unity that was formed by African nations a year or two prior. And so he wanted to connect the Black American struggle to the global third world movement. He called it the dark world that he wanted to unite. Now, that for him was an ummah. Now, the Muslim Mosque Incorporated gives us a clue into his maintenance of a movement that he wanted Muslims to be a part of. So he frequently spoke about the failure of Muslims at the time to bring and brand and market their faith to Black Americans. So there's fertile ground for it, and understanding the deep emphasis on justice, seeing people, not only when he was at Hajj in Mecca, but in Egypt. He spent a long time in Egypt studying Islam, Arabic, in the summer of 1964, and then meeting with leaders through the Organization of African Unity's conference there.
And individual scholars, someone like Malik Badri and others.
From Sudan. But he met Malik Badri in Lebanon.
In Lebanon, yes.
So, and Sudan was, Lebanon was actually an interesting place of Sudanese intellectuals being there. And so Sudanese intellectuals organized a talk for him at the Sudanese Cultural Center in Beirut. And he spoke there. And somebody who's now a big figure in the Muslim community globally, Aziza Al-Hibri, who also was part of the women's movement, Third World Women's Movement, she went to that talk, was inspired, and tried to bring him, and did successfully bring him, though the university resisted a lot initially. And I write about the process of how she brought him to speak at the American University of Beirut. And they were fascinated by what he was proposing, because at the time he was making really interesting connections between leaders in Saudi Arabia and Egypt. And another spiritual figure he was very committed to and inspired by was Abdulaziz, not Abdulaziz, oh my God, Azam Pasha. And Azam Pasha wrote this book called The Eternal Message of Muhammad that Malcolm read and referenced in his diaries. Like, he has quotes. And he met him in Saudi Arabia when he was a guest of the state. And he quotes a lot from the work. But I, in my work, was able to find the ways that he interpolated meaning for himself. And in that, what's really fascinating is that this piece of work, The Eternal Message of Muhammad, trying to takes lessons to understand why Muslims should be against colonialism, should be against political economic systems that are oppressive. So Malcolm is starting to see, he's always seen through the nation's commitment to freedom, justice, and equality, but more so now he's marrying all these different parts of the people that he's Pan-Africanists like Queen Mother Moore, Pan-Africanists across the continent. It's a big community in Ghana, in Kenya and Tanzania. I would say, to sum up this large lecture that I just gave, that the issue we have with the post-assassination Malcolm and the way that people connect to him is they make him one thing, but he
Right.
was so many things. He was committed to third worldism. He saw it as an Afro-Asiatic unity. He was committed to what he called the 22 million victims of democracy, African Americans. He was committed to a Pan-African vision, and he was committed to a very Islamic humanist lens and journey. So those things were the totality of who he was. And lastly, I'll say, part of his work connecting with these world leaders was to get them to bring the issue of Black Americans to the United Nations to hold the US accountable. Because what was happening that people take for granted without understanding the historical context is the United Nations starts after World War II with nation states. And the nation states at that point were mostly the West because other places were colonized. But then the 50s happened and the 60s happened. And these countries that are becoming decolonized are also entering the UN as member states. So the UN is becoming heavily global South. And so they have the numeric power to bring attention to Black Americans and the plight that they are experiencing. And this has happened too, not just with Malcolm. This wasn't the first time it happened. We charged genocide, which happened, a decade prior, was part of this legacy. So that's the work that Malcolm wanted to do, that had all these lenses, had this quilt that was part of who he was.
Right. Maytha, I know that this is an obviously one incident in his life, but and a very tragic one. But of course, the debate persists of his assassination, and people have obviously speculated whether the Nation of Islam in concert with the National Security State or the FBI and so on. Any thoughts of yours or reflections of yours that, I mean, the research that you have done that have demonstrated conclusively what transpired at that point in his assassination?
You know what I like to say, and I know people hate hearing this, but I like focusing more on his life than his death. I'm not a scholar of his assassination, but I know people who have a second by second, minute by minute breakdown, and have looked at very extensively law enforcement records around this. And there are tons of scholars that do this work. But what I could say from the work that we did in the MalcolmX project is that it was pretty clear. I mean, so there was different levels of law enforcement that were after him. There was clearly an NYPD, BOSS, which is the Bureau of Special Services, that's located in New York. There's the FBI, the CIA as well. Think about all those levels.
Incredible, yeah. I mean,
and
domestically, yeah.
The State Department even inquired to see if Malcolm meeting with heads of state without the permission of the U.S. was enough to try him on the Logan Act for treason.
Wow.
So everybody was trying to get him, including the nation that had a gripe against him.
Right.
Or elements of the nation, I will say, that had a gripe against him. And there are, as I said, so many different theories out there.
Of course.
That can pin the exact people who were involved in the assassination, and the fact that people who were taken in might not have been a part of the assassination, and others who did are still alive. And then questions of who were the people who gave the green light for the assassination. So the belief is that during this period, with the aggressive surveillance and infiltration by an FBO special unit called COINTELPRO, started by J. Edgar Hoover, to, as he said, dismantle, decapitate the Black Freedom Movement. He didn't call it Black Freedom Movement, but as he said, the next Black Messiah. They were committed to doing the work to create hostility, to create infighting in these organizations that would lead to their eruption or disintegration.
Right.
And so a part of that is trying to hedge people against each other. And
Yes.
Malcolm, as a very popular national spokesperson who might have been a little too political at times for the nation. What I mean by that is the nation was actually kind of separatist, even though they admired the movements that were happening globally. They didn't want to
Mm.
get involved with the politics of what was happening in the US, but Malcolm would speak to those things.
Right.
Malcolm would show up at at most sites where there was a case of police murder, brutality
Mm.
towards the Black American community, and that was pushing it too far for them, even though there were members that were assassinated by law enforcement. And then it
That's
went
right.
way too far for them when he commented on JFK's assassination, which was it's a much longer conversation, but the snippet that people point to is it's uh it's a case of the chickens coming home to roost, which is basically him saying that a nation that enacts violence begets violence, and that, if
Right.
you look at his speeches, was a big part of how he
Mm.
understood American imperialism, both globally
Hmm.
and then, as he called it, domestic colonialism that was happening to Black Americans.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
for him,
The only reason I totally agree with you. I mean, you said it beautifully that yes, it's you'd like to focus on his life rather than the death. And yeah, it just struck me because I heard an interview with the famous Pakistani, British Pakistani author Tariq Ali,
oh
who
yes,
writes about when they invited him to Oxford
yep, in the UK,
and
yeah,
did a wonderful job. And but afterwards, he said that Tariq Ali spoke to him and said that I really look forward to seeing you again. And Malcolm pretty much told him, I don't think that's going to happen.
yeah,
And Tariq asked him why. He's like, no, I don't think I have much longer. And so it was
okay,
it was very curious, I mean, at that point, and the other reason I asked it is that did it also kind of represent uh, these transformations that we're talking about, that of course the evolution of Malcolm X in his thought and his praxis that were increasingly becoming threatening
yes,
to the status quo.
absolutely. So Malcolm, as I said, I mean, as soon as he goes abroad, there's
Yeah.
discussion. The highest echelons of the state, the Secretary of State is writing
Yeah.
in declassified files that we now see to inquire if they could try him. So
Right.
for them, I mean, for these decades, remember that this was a bipolar world, right?
Yeah.
So the power of non-alignment was to play up the US versus the Soviet Union. And so they were creating their own power, or they were carving out a power space. And so
Hmm.
Malcolm wanted to link the Black American freedom movement to that block of power that was
Hmm.
emerging, and taking up a space of neutrality from that infighting. But
Yes.
during this time, what the U.S. was also trying to do through jazz diplomacy tours was appeal to the decolonizing world and say, look, we have Black faces like you guys, and not at all engaging the racial politics, because the racial
Right.
politics were what drove them very deeply in a hole that nobody wanted to be on the US's agenda around. So that's the dirty secret that they've been trying to hide from the world,
Right.
especially during this time period. And so for Malcolm to shine a light on it, and that's what he continuously said in his,
Right.
is that I'm telling them they didn't know how bad it was. They had no idea. But also remember, during this time, or if people didn't know, there were Black Americans who were traveling and migrating to cities in Africa like Accra, to places in the Middle East
Mm.
like Beirut, Cairo. You know, I did some work on folks in Cairo, and they were starting
Mm.
to make connections with the movements in those areas, and even W.B. Du Bois's widow, who went from Accra to Cairo, and her
Hmm.
son ended up working in an Egyptian newspaper called, oh my God, why is it slipping my mind? He worked in an Egyptian newspaper. Maya Angelou worked in an Egyptian English
Ah.
language publication called the Arab Observer. So they started to even work in these spaces to make those connections.
Wow.
And so yeah, he was threatening, and he knew it. He knew he was being followed. He also
Yeah.
knew 1964 might be his last year, and he ended up going 2 months into 1965. He was very well aware of that. I mean, there's you can look online. There's a very interesting and infamous recording that he did of an FBI visit to his house where they were
Mm.
trying to convince him to become an informant against the Nation of Islam. And the way he held that FBI agent accountable was fascinating. I mean, also
Oh,
his house was firebombed um,
yes. Right.
in Queens, and so that was, you know, the writing was on the wall there, and that's why he started to stay at a hotel afterwards and put his family in a safe house and distanced him from his family. And there is a speech called After the Bombing, and you'll see it and look into it. If you look into it, you'll see that he's he knew his time was coming. He knew he was going to be a
Yeah.
martyr for the movement, and
Yeah.
he understood the sacrifices that it took. Of course, he didn't want to leave a family of daughters. His wife was pregnant
Yes.
too when he passed. Um, but that's it's an incredible life to bear witness to and to
Yeah.
continue the work that was left unfinished because of the brutal assassination that was done in front of
Absolutely.
his family.
Absolutely. No, I mean, I when you hear that, and it's online, that Tariq Ali, when he speaks about it, and when he hears Malcolm's response, and then digs further to see why is Malcolm responding that way, that they won't see each other again, and telling him that I don't think I have much time left. And Tariq could not sleep that night. He said, "This amazing figure," and it was the young Tariq Ali in the in his 20s and so on, and he's just like he's incredibly, I mean, distraught, and at that point, and that's what kind of brought me to kind of that question. But Maytha, I do want to kind of say that wow, this was a tour de force journey in such a limited time, and as you say, that it's for us academics is very difficult to do something like this in this amount of time. But so the final thing that I will ask you on, and of course you've touched upon it within the things you've stated before, is what can Muslims now, I mean, it's a, people are finding them in themselves in a variety of contexts. American Muslims, the issues that they're dealing with, global Islamophobia, ongoing wars within the larger Middle East, Muslim lands, refugee crises, etc. All of these things. I know it's a whole lot of things, but in some ways, if you just had to kind of hone in and say that what the life of Malcolm X kind of represented in terms of dealing with all of these global cruelties and injustices that are taking place, what would you have to say?
Ooh, these are the times that I do miss a Malcolm voice because not only was he prescient, he had such a powerful, accessible, oratorially vibrant
Yeah.
way of connecting all these
Oh yeah.
global crises with each other. That's why
Yes.
I'm able to look at his speeches because he can go from the Mau Mau in Kenya to what was happening
Yeah.
in Vietnam, what happened in Korea, to what's going on in Detroit, what's going on
Right.
in Los Angeles, um, and then what's happening in South Africa. You know, he just had his
Yes.
pulse. But what I would say is there's a movement in the US going on around abolition that came out of a prison abolition movement, which I've been a part of
Mm.
since 2006. And that's precisely the time that I started to do work on the Malcolm X project. I was going to school at Columbia in Harlem and then getting my education on 125th Street, and then also working with an organization creating arts-based workshops for incarcerated
Hmm.
at Rikers Island, which is the largest uh,
Yes.
colony in America, I believe. So what he the prison abolition movement, as I said, transforms into an abolition movement. But what they basically have been saying is we have to divest from our addiction around punishment to solutions that are regenerative, to community
Right.
well at the center. And I always am reluctant to say Malcolm would be on board of this thing, but
Right.
understanding his commitment to freedom, justice, and equality, the values of an abolitionist movement that envisions a world where we're free of um, places that police us, systems that pull the rug underneath us so we don't have access to clean water, food, resources, adequate housing, free education. That not attending to that and
Yeah.
instead investing money in a military apparatus, in a border
Right.
patrol, in law enforcement, where all those issues of migration, right? All those
Right.
issues of robbery, of what we conceive of crime, could be solved if money
Right.
was put in. And as you know, we're talking about Malcolm,
Absolutely.
but Martin Luther King says in his speech at Riverside Church in
Right.
April 4th, 1967, the year before he passed,
Yes.
that look at he went into detail about how much it costs to kill somebody in Vietnam and how little they pay for poor folks to have access to food or goods. So I think
Right.
he would make those connections for us. He would see that like a really robust military budget, nuclear armament, all these things
Mm.
that we see as solutions are a path towards dystopian destruction versus
Right.
how we could reconnect with the earth, with each other, if we were on a mission towards caring for ourselves. So as we
Right.
say in the States, care not cages. So that's I think the lens that we have to, in order to align ourselves with the spirit, with the afterlife of Malcolm X's legacy, say is what does it look like to not only enact justice, but what is the most caring thing we can do to each other? And then
Right.
also being that embodiment so that systems get shifted and changed. But we have to be able to employ an imagination that understands what our freedom could look like. And that's
Absolutely.
what Malcolm
That's
did.
No, that's wonderful. And I hate to do this because I did want to wrap up with that, but one issue that I think that maybe I wanted to push you on, if there is some substance there, the issue of Malcolm's spirituality, a Muslim spirituality that perhaps also played a role in defining who he was. Do you have any thoughts on that,
Oh yeah, I
Maytha?
mean that was really consistent in his writing and his work, and he again was thinking through what he learned through the nation, and then some things afterwards he saw as his own psychological issues for putting
Right.
Elijah Muhammad on a pedestal because he didn't have a father figure. His father was murdered,
Mm.
so he was constantly searching for that that, and his mother was put into a mental institution. So he's
Right.
searching for a spiritual guide. That's why he became close to spiritual guides and actually
Yes.
insisted that a Sudanese sheikh be the one who was in charge of his Muslim Mosque Incorporated activities and who actually
Mm.
performed uh, the janaza for him when he was assassinated. So um, Malcolm was so committed. I mean, one of the things that he says in his work is when you're with God, God is with you. So
Hmm.
he had a lot of these moments of just basically dropping the mic around
Yes.
the spiritual work that he's navigating to do. As you talk about the praxis he's doing, it's not just theory.
Right.
He's really trying to take inventory around who he is, how he shows up, and how that is connected to the politics. So the politics, as we say, is always personal, but is contingent for him on doing that work of, you know, being a part of a ummah. And I will say, sorry, the last thing, is he
Yes.
saw racism as a spiritual disease.
Mm.
So that's that's what he knew he needed to communicate on this journey he was taking globally. Because
Right.
people in America understood that, although he did talk to communities about the way that white supremacy functions around the beauty standards that we have. You can't hate yourself. Um, but he also was trying to impress upon people that to hate people for their skin color, for their phenotype, for a set um, of, of oppressive beliefs,
Mm.
pseudoscience turned into sociological construction of who people are. That in itself is a deep spiritual crisis. I mean,
Right.
that's, well, you know, what we
Right.
say is the very act of the very first act of racism is Iblis refusing to bow down to
Yes.
humans because he saw
Right.
himself superior to them. Or
Right.
I don't want to anthropomorphize
Right. 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 Right.
of another world, but what Iblis saw was a superiority. So any version of feeling superior to another people based
Mm.
on circumstance, based on social construction, based on political economic construction, that was
Yes.
a violation of faith. And so
Yes.
that is a message that I think we can definitely carry in the work that we do and interrogate whether or not we are being um, actively anti-racism for the sake of our faith and for the sake of how we're connected to each other.
Wonderful, wonderful. Dr. Maytha Alhassen, I wish we could, go on and on, because Malcolm was such that type of a figure that, I mean, obviously you would appreciate probably even more than I, but someone that I certainly have taken an incredible inspiration from the life and legacy of someone like Malcolm X. One for me, one of the great uh, black thinkers, black Muslim thinkers of the 20th century, and
Thinkers in general for me, thinkers in general.
yeah, thinkers in general. I mean, it's unquestionably, and you know. People who have read his books, who have read the autobiography or Manning Marable's book, and seen the movie, just it's Denzel Washington in it, but you get a sense of the
Yeah.
power of the word of this man, and the inspiration that I mean, he causes all around him, in people that want to join and want to make a difference in what's going on in the country. But we can go on about it. Maybe we'll do another show when I know that you can perhaps take some time from your very, very busy schedule, and your excellent work, and your commitments to social justice, and to your excellent scholarship and academic inquiry into all of these issues. So, but for now, I did want to genuinely thank you for your phenomenal presentation on the legacy, the life and legacy of Malcolm X. Not easy to do in the time limit that we gave you, but you did an absolutely amazing job in doing that. And we want to thank you for being on the show today.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Maytha Alhassen. Take care.
You too.